Wagner.
Mr Speaker, I support this bill and look forward to the recovery and rebuild of Christchurch.
Mr Speaker.
Charles Chauvel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I'm going to take a short call. Normally this is a call that would be taken by my colleague Leanne Dalzell, but she's asked me to say that she's unable to speak in the third reading of the debate as she's holding a community meeting in her electorate. Something that she's been doing regularly, I think, since the first earthquake. So the first thing I wanted to say was to convey her apologies for not being able to be in the House for the conclusion of this debate and to explain the reason for that absence. Other members of the Labor team have explained that we've decided on a collective basis to support the Canterbury emergency legislation, and they've also made a commitment, particularly those Canterbury members who will be working on the ground, continuing to work on the ground, that they will try to make this model work. They've said that it's not the model that we would have chosen. We would have preferred to see evidence that the government had taken into account best international practice around recovery. If that had been done, there would have been much more emphasis on collaboration with the communities affected by the earthquake, and there probably wouldn't have been a model held so closely by the Minister, so closely to the Crown. There probably would have been the continuation of some sort of Crown entity structure, allowing less direction and more community cooperation than we're going to probably see under the model that we have. But it is what it is. And rather than oppose it, given that it is the only option on offer, as it were, from the government, we've decided that it will be supported. And as I say, the decision is that we will simply try to make what we see as a less than ideal model work on the ground. Sir, I said in my earlier contribution that I thought there were a number of areas where the legislation goes too far. It is unconstitutional in at least 4 or 5 respects. And I want to repeat for the House why that is. First of all, we have legislation that can be suspended by regulation, and a low test for that suspension. The Minister just has to think that it's expedient for that suspension to occur. Wars have been fought over less, but here we go, conferring that power merrily on the Executive in 2011. Then there's the attempt to say to the High Court, you can't review the exercise of the Minister's decisions to make these regulations which suspend statutes. The way in which this is done is inelegant and probably ineffective, as experts have pointed out. And probably most members of the House don't take a huge or close interest in the way in which there is an interplay between the competing sources of power in our Constitution. But it is something that I do take an interest in. And I'm sure other lawyers in the House are aware that actually there is fragility in the balance of power in our Constitution. The judges are watching closely as to whether or not, now that the right of appeal, the final right of appeal, sits across the road, now that this Parliament is apparently seized of a desire to surrender certain of its powers to the Executive, the courts are watching closely as to whether or not that is an appropriate exercise of power by this House. Kennedy Graham said in his contribution earlier that there is no written constitution in this country. The danger that we face if we provoke the judiciary with provisions such as the one that I have just spoken about is that we will run the risk that the courts will start to discover unwritten rights, that they will nonetheless enforce against this place because they regard us as having changed the Constitution in unacceptable ways. And my concern about this legislation today is that we are doing this and that is the risk we are running. Now, if it were a necessary risk to run, if it were obvious that the Minister needed these powers, if they had, for example, been required under the September 2010 legislation and been used time and time again for good purpose, maybe it would be possible to relax about it. But, sir, that is not the case. Though these sorts of powers haven't been required, although they have existed under that used. So why, I ask, do we risk causing a constitutional crisis by seeking to enact these sorts of powers, which we are told and which I accept are very unlikely ever to be required? It is folly, it is irresponsible, it will have, I fear, much wider consequences than most people in this House have thought about. And, sir, the risks that we have incurred today to the way in which it is accepted that our Constitution ought to be balanced, unfortunately cannot be overstated. There are other problems with the bill. There's no need to water down privacy rights in the way that is contemplated by clauses 29 and 30. We already have a perfectly acceptable solution to information sharing issues that's been put in place by the Privacy Commissioner, the independent expert charged with responsibility for these matters. We're retrospectively validating the activity of officials where they already have validation under the Civil Defence and Emergency Management Act. It is, again, unnecessary, provocative and an overreach of our powers to do it twice, and the question has to be asked, why is it being done? Finally, sir, the rights of citizens to have their interests declared to be of a certain nature by the courts are disturbed by Clause 68. There are restrictions placed by this Parliament, or to be placed by this Parliament, on the way in which appeals are to be carried out. There is no need to interfere with the processes of the court in this way. A simple legislative direction that the court is to have regard to its inherent powers to control vexatious or unduly prolonging litigation would have been sufficient. Instead, the drafters have insisted on an outdated model by which to proceed, and again it is provocative and it will be constitutionally dangerous. It's no answer that these powers already exist in the 2010 law and that they haven't been abused. It's wrong for Nicky Wagner and Rahui Kātane and others to assert that there are sufficient checks and balances. There are not. These are bad precedents. They are unconstitutional. Our arrangements are more fragile than many understand, and this is, as I say, folly. We would have been much better to have just enacted the Legislation Advisory Committee's model for emergency legislation and left it at that. Sir, there have been criticisms of the process and many of those criticisms are entirely justified. I would simply say that I've also seen some very good behaviour from certain parliamentarians, and I record my thanks for that behaviour, because some people have actually risen above their baser instincts and behaved nobly in this process. And I have seen parliamentarians taking their scrutiny job seriously, and I respect those people for the way in which they've discharged their responsibilities. But there's also been a really unfortunate tone that's crept into this debate. There's been sniping, there have been accusations of bad faith, there have been petty exchanges across the House that this legislation really should render inappropriate. And sir, many people say there's nothing worse than a bad loser. I think there is, and that's a bad winner. And I hope that that isn't a portent of things to come and the way in which this legislation will be administered, because if it is, that'll be a very bad thing for Canterbury and for this country.
Mr Speaker.
Nikki Kay.
I support this legislation, and I just want to make this one point. The recovery and rebuild in Christchurch, the rebuild of the many hearts and broken homes, does not lie within one piece of legislation and one minister. It lies, and the burden lies with all of us. So all New Zealanders share the burden of Christchurch, including people from Auckland, and I'm proud in this House to be passing this piece of legislation, an urgent and necessary piece of legislation for New Zealand.
Brendan Burns.
Mr Speaker.